November 15, 1941. Naval General Staff Headquarters, Tokyo. Captain Takajiro Ohnishi leans over a table covered with charts, his fountain pen moving across columns of numbers that will determine the fate of an empire. Outside, the first cold winds of winter rattle the windows. Inside, staff officers work through the night, calculating fuel consumption rates, tanker capacities, and logistics trains for an operation that will ignite the Pacific. They're planning the most audacious naval offensive in history, a simultaneous assault across 8,000 miles of ocean, from Hawaii to Malaya to the Philippines. Everything depends on these numbers. Everything. Ohnishi checks his calculations one final time. The combined fleet will require approximately 1.8 million barrels of fuel oil per month to maintain offensive operations after the initial strikes. Japan's tanker fleet, he calculates, can deliver 2.1 million barrels monthly to forward areas. The numbers work. They have a margin of safety, even accounting for losses and delays. He initials the logistics assessment and passes it up the chain of command. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto reviews the figures, sees the positive margin, and proceeds with operational planning. Emperor Hirohito receives assurances that Japan possesses the logistical capability to sustain its offensive. The decision for war moves forward, built on this foundation of mathematics. But Ohnishi made a mistake. A single error in his fuel consumption calculations, a misplaced decimal point in tanker efficiency ratings, an underestimation of real-world operational fuel burn rates. The actual fuel delivery capacity isn't 2.1 million barrels per month. It's 1.4 million. Japan is about to launch a war requiring resources it doesn't have, cannot obtain, and cannot sustain. This miscalculation, buried in spreadsheets and logistics reports that November, will prove more devastating than any American weapon. It will doom operations before they begin, strangle offensives in mid-execution, and transform what Japanese planners envisioned as a quick, decisive campaign into a slow asphyxiation. This is the story of how one mathematical error, made by exhausted staff officers under impossible pressure, destroyed an empire's dreams and condemned millions to a war that mathematics had already decided. To understand why this calculation mattered so catastrophically, you must first grasp Japan's resource nightmare in 1941. The island nation imports 88% of its oil, the vast majority from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. Japanese steel production requires Australian iron ore. Japanese industry consumes American scrap metal. The empire is an industrial power completely dependent on the nations it seeks to displace. When Japan invades French Indochina in July 1941, pursuing its expansion into Southeast Asia, the United States responds with an oil embargo. Britain and the Dutch government in exile join the sanctions. Overnight, Japan loses access to 90% of its petroleum imports. The fuel reserves Japan has stockpiled, approximately 9 million barrels of oil, will sustain the combined fleet for roughly 18 months at peacetime consumption rates. Under wartime operations, that timeline contracts to less than 1 year. The Japanese leadership faces an impossible choice. Withdraw from China and Indochina, abandoning years of conquest and national prestige, or seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia by force, knowing this means war with America, Britain, and the Netherlands. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo frames the dilemma starkly: we are like a fish in a pond from which the water is gradually being drained away. We can wait until we are gasping in the mud, or we can jump while we still have the strength. The Naval General Staff begins planning Operation AI, the simultaneous offensive that will secure Southeast Asian resources before American military power can fully mobilize. They will strike Pearl Harbor to cripple American naval strength, invade the Philippines to eliminate America's forward base, seize Malaya and Singapore to destroy British power in Asia, and capture the Dutch East Indies to access its oil fields. It's breathtakingly ambitious, offensive spanning a quarter of the globe, but Japanese planners believe they have one crucial advantage: speed. Hit everywhere at once, establish a defensive perimeter before America can respond, then negotiate from strength. Everything depends on logistics. The combined fleet must have fuel to reach its targets, support the invasions, and establish the defensive perimeter. This is where Captain Ohnishi and his logistics team enter the equation, armed with slide rules, charts of fuel consumption rates, and crushing deadlines. The calculation that doomed Japan seems deceptively simple. How much fuel can Japan's tanker fleet deliver to forward operating bases per month, and how does that compare to the combined fleet's consumption? Ohnishi's team begins with Japan's available tanker tonnage, approximately 560,000 tons of tanker capacity, a mixture of purpose-built oil tankers and converted merchant vessels. They calculate average tanker speed at 12 knots, average cargo capacity at 8,000 tons of fuel oil per vessel, and estimated round-trip times from Japan to forward bases in the Philippines, Singapore, and the Central Pacific. The first error creeps in here, subtle but fatal. Ohnishi's calculations use theoretical maximum cargo capacity, not actual operational loads. Real-world tankers rarely fill to maximum capacity. Fuel expansion in tropical heat requires empty space. Weather damage necessitates partial loads. Port infrastructure limitations restrict pumping rates. The actual average cargo per tanker run will be closer to 6,800 tons, not 8,000 tons. That's a 15% discrepancy, but Ohnishi doesn't account for it. The second error compounds the first. Ohnishi calculates tanker transit times using peacetime routing and weather conditions. He doesn't adequately account for wartime zigzagging to avoid submarines, weather delays in the Pacific's typhoon season, or port congestion as multiple tankers compete for limited pier space at forward bases. His calculation assumes a tanker can complete a round trip from Japan to Truk in the Caroline Islands in 18 days. The actual average will be 26 days. That's a 44% increase in delivery cycle time, which directly reduces the number of deliveries each tanker can make per month. The third error proves most devastating. Ohnishi underestimates fuel consumption rates for the combined fleet under combat operations. His calculations use consumption data from peacetime exercises and maneuvers, with modest adjustments for combat intensity. But peacetime exercises don't replicate the fuel-hungry reality of sustained high-speed steaming, evasive maneuvers during air attacks, and emergency operations. A battleship cruising at 15 knots consumes approximately 800 barrels of fuel per day. That same battleship maneuvering at 28 knots during combat operations consumes 3,200 barrels per day, 4 times the fuel for less than double the speed. Ohnishi's calculations underestimate average fleet consumption by approximately 30%. These three errors, each seemingly modest in isolation, combine multiplicatively. 15% less cargo capacity, times 44% longer delivery cycles, times 30% higher consumption rates. The mathematics become brutal. Ohnishi calculates Japan can deliver 2.1 million barrels monthly to forward areas. The reality is 1.4 million barrels monthly. The deficit is 700,000 barrels per month, roughly one-third of total requirements. Japan is about to launch a war with a fuel supply that cannot sustain its naval operations for more than 4 months before reserves run critically low. Nobody catches the error. Ohnishi's immediate superior, Captain Shigeru Fukudome, reviews the calculations but doesn't perform independent verification. The numbers show positive margins, and Fukudome is under pressure to approve the logistics plan so operational planning can proceed. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, receives a summary briefing showing fuel sufficiency. He doesn't examine the underlying assumptions. The bureaucratic incentive structure encourages optimistic assessments. Officers who raise concerns about resource adequacy are seen as defeatists, undermining national morale. In the pressure cooker environment of late 1941, with political leadership demanding action, thorough review becomes an unaffordable luxury. The error passes up the chain of command, each level adding its endorsement, until it reaches the planners finalizing the decision for war. Admiral Yamamoto, despite his personal misgivings about fighting America, sees logistics reports indicating fuel adequacy and proceeds with operational planning. The die is cast, built on mathematics that exist only on paper. December 7, 1941.
Pearl Harbor.
The Japanese strike achieves tactical surprise, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and destroying 188 aircraft. Simultaneously, Japanese forces land in Malaya, attack the Philippines, and begin their sweep southward. The initial phase proceeds brilliantly. By March 1942, Japan controls the Dutch East Indies and its oil fields, secures Singapore, and establishes a defensive perimeter stretching from Burma to the Central Pacific. The first months seem to validate every optimistic assumption. But Captain Yahachi Tanabe, commanding officer of the fleet oiler Kenyo Maru, notices something disturbing in January 1942. His ship is operating at 130% of expected sortie rates. Instead of one delivery run every 3 weeks, as the logistics plan projected, he's completing runs every 16 days. Fleet fuel consumption is running significantly higher than planned, and tanker availability can't keep pace. Tanabe reports the discrepancy to his superior officers. The response is terse: maintain schedule, increase efficiency. The institutional assumption is that early wartime confusion will sort itself out. It doesn't sort itself out. By March 1942, disturbing reports accumulate at Naval General Staff Headquarters. Fleet oilers report sustained overwork. Forward base fuel stocks are lower than projections. Several operations require last-minute postponements while tankers deliver emergency fuel supplies. Captain Fukudome, now promoted to Rear Admiral, begins a systematic review of actual fuel consumption versus projections.
The results horrify him.
The combined fleet is consuming 2.3 million barrels per month, not the projected 1.8 million. Tanker deliveries average 1.4 million barrels monthly, not the calculated 2.1 million. Japan is burning through its strategic reserves at a rate of 900,000 barrels per month. The 9 million barrel stockpile, theoretically sufficient for 18 months of operations, will be exhausted in less than 10 months at current consumption rates. By January 1943, the combined fleet will be operating on fumes unless operations scale back dramatically. Fukudome presents these findings to Admiral Nagano in April 1942.
The meeting is tense.
Nagano's first reaction is anger, then denial, then a grim acceptance of reality. The mathematical truth is inescapable. Japan has perhaps 6 months of offensive capability remaining before fuel constraints force a transition to defensive operations. Every major operation from this point forward must be evaluated not just on strategic merit, but on fuel consumption. The empire is fighting on borrowed time, and the hourglass is running out faster than anyone anticipated. The impact on operations proves immediate and catastrophic. Admiral Yamamoto plans a decisive operation to draw out and destroy the American Pacific Fleet, still reeling from Pearl Harbor. He targets Midway Island, knowing the Americans must defend this critical outpost. But the Midway operation requires massive fuel expenditures. The strike force alone will consume approximately 400,000 barrels of fuel for the entire operation. When Yamamoto presents his plan, he receives unexpected resistance from the Naval General Staff. They question whether Japan can afford such fuel-intensive operations while reserves drain rapidly. Yamamoto argues passionately that only a decisive victory can end the war before American industrial production overwhelms Japan. He needs this operation. Reluctantly, the Naval General Staff approves, but with restrictions. Yamamoto cannot take his entire combined fleet. Certain capital ships must remain in home waters due to fuel constraints. The compromises weaken his force at the margins, but Yamamoto proceeds, believing he still has overwhelming superiority. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 ends in catastrophic defeat. Japan loses 4 fleet carriers, the heart of its naval air power. But beyond the immediate tactical disaster, the fuel mathematics now become impossible. The loss of 4 carriers should simplify fuel logistics. Fewer ships means less consumption. But Japan must now defend a vast perimeter with reduced forces, requiring dispersed deployments that actually increase total fuel consumption. Ships must patrol larger areas, steam longer distances, maintain higher readiness states. The fuel crisis accelerates. By August 1942, as American forces land on Guadalcanal, Japan's strategic fuel reserves have fallen below 6 million barrels. Naval operations around Guadalcanal consume fuel at staggering rates. The Tokyo Express fast cruiser runs to reinforce the island burn fuel extravagantly, racing down the slot at high speed to deliver troops and supplies while avoiding daytime air attacks. Each run consumes fuel budgeted for a week of normal operations. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, now acutely aware of fuel limitations, must make agonizing choices about which operations receive priority. In October 1942, Yamamoto concentrates his remaining carriers for a decisive engagement near the Santa Cruz Islands. His goal is to destroy American carriers supporting the Guadalcanal operation. Japan wins a tactical victory, damaging the carrier USS Enterprise and sinking USS Hornet. But the operation consumes nearly 300,000 barrels of fuel, 20% of that month's entire allocation for the combined fleet. For this expenditure, Japan gains no strategic advantage. The Americans continue operations from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Yamamoto's fuel reserves continue their inexorable decline. The Japanese Navy begins implementing desperate fuel conservation measures. Capital ships reduce steaming time, staying in port except for essential operations. Training exercises for carrier pilots are curtailed to save aviation fuel. New pilots join the fleet with barely 100 hours of flight time, compared to the 300 to 500 hours typical for veterans of Pearl Harbor and Midway. This fuel-driven training reduction will compound into a death spiral of decreasing pilot quality and increasing losses. By January 1943, strategic fuel reserves fall below 4 million barrels. That's barely enough for 4 months of minimal defensive operations. The oil fields Japan captured in the Dutch East Indies are now producing, but output remains far below expectations. Allied submarine attacks sink tankers bringing oil from the East Indies to Japan. Of the 1.2 million barrels produced monthly in the East Indies, only 600,000 barrels reach Japan. The rest is lost to submarines, production delays, or consumed locally. The fuel shortage forces strategic decisions that accelerate Japan's defeat. When American forces bypass heavily defended positions and leapfrog across the Pacific, Japan lacks the fuel to redeploy naval forces to counter these moves. The combined fleet must husband its dwindling fuel stocks for a decisive battle that never comes. Major warships sit idle in home waters, conserving fuel while American forces methodically capture island after island. In April 1943, Admiral Yamamoto dies when American fighters, acting on intercepted intelligence, shoot down his transport aircraft over Bougainville. His death symbolizes Japan's larger strategic death. The man who understood Japan's resource limitations, who knew from the beginning that the war must be won quickly or not at all, dies as his worst fears materialize. The fuel calculations that were wrong from the beginning have now trapped Japan in an unwinnable position. The cascading consequences continue through 1944. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japan's carriers launch aircraft against American forces but achieve minimal results. American pilots, trained with unlimited fuel for realistic combat exercises, dominate Japanese pilots whose training was curtailed by fuel shortages. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot sees Japan lose 600 aircraft and 3 carriers. The fuel crisis that began with Ohnishi's miscalculations in 1941 has now metastasized into a crisis of combat effectiveness across every dimension of naval warfare. By October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan's fuel situation becomes openly desperate. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force can barely fuel its warships for the approach to Leyte. Several destroyers must be left behind due to fuel shortages. During the battle, Kurita's force achieves tactical surprise and nearly reaches the vulnerable American amphibious fleet. But at the critical moment, with victory within grasp, Kurita orders retreat. Post-war interviews reveal fuel anxiety as a major factor in his decision. He feared his ships lacked fuel for extended combat and withdrawal. An American victory that should have been costly instead becomes a complete rout, partly because Japanese commanders are making decisions based on fuel gauges rather than tactical situations. The final manifestation of Japan's fuel crisis comes with the kamikaze attacks. When conventional naval operations become impossible due to fuel shortages and pilot quality decline, Japan embraces suicide tactics. A kamikaze pilot requires minimal training and one-way fuel allocation. The mathematics are brutal but undeniable. For the fuel cost of one conventional combat sortie by trained pilots, Japan can launch 15 to 20 kamikaze attacks. It's the logical endpoint of a nation that ran out of fuel before it ran out of young men willing to die. In the war's final months, the combined fleet effectively ceases to exist as an operational force. The super battleship Yamato makes its final sortie to Okinawa in April 1945 with only enough fuel for a one-way trip. The plan is to beach the ship and use it as an immobile fortress. American aircraft sink Yamato before it reaches Okinawa, but the mission's planning reveals how completely fuel shortages have paralyzed Japanese naval power. The largest battleship ever built is reduced to a suicide mission because Japan cannot fuel a return voyage. When Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the combined fleet's fuel reserves have fallen to approximately 200,000 barrels, enough for perhaps 2 weeks of minimal operations. The empire that began the war to secure oil resources has ended it more desperately short of fuel than when it started. The captured oil fields in the East Indies are now beyond Japan's reach, American submarines having effectively severed the tanker routes. The mathematical impossibility that Captain Ohnishi's calculations obscured in 1941 has been demonstrated through 4 years of brutal arithmetic. Post-war analysis by both American and Japanese military historians identifies the fuel miscalculation as among the most consequential errors of the Pacific War. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey examines captured Japanese logistics records and concludes that Japan's fuel shortfall appeared in operational constraints as early as May 1942, just 6 months into the war. The survey notes that virtually every major Japanese operation after Midway bore the fingerprints of fuel scarcity, curtailed training, limited deployment options, inability to sustain offensives, and declining operational flexibility. Captain Takajiro Ohnishi, the officer whose calculations underpin Japan's fuel planning, survived the war. In post-war interrogations, he acknowledged the errors in his 1941 logistics assessments. He explained the immense pressure staff officers faced to produce optimistic projections, the institutional bias against pessimistic assessments, and the simple human reality that exhausted planners make mistakes when working 18-hour days under impossible deadlines. Ohnishi noted, with bitter irony, that his calculations were technically correct based on the assumptions and data he had available. The errors lay in assumptions that proved incorrect under wartime realities: actual versus theoretical cargo capacities, peacetime versus wartime consumption rates, planned versus actual operational tempos. The legacy of this mathematical catastrophe extends beyond Japan's defeat. It serves as a stark reminder that wars are ultimately contests of logistics and resources, not just courage and tactics. Japan entered a war it could not sustain because planners told leaders what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to know. The institutional and political pressures that prevented honest resource assessment proved as destructive as any military defeat. In the final accounting, Captain Ohnishi's miscalculation in November 1941 killed more Japanese servicemen than any single battle. The fuel shortfall crippled training programs, creating underprepared pilots who died in disproportionate numbers. It forced strategic decisions that exposed forces to defeat in detail. It prevented reinforcement of threatened positions and retreat from untenable ones. The mathematics were unforgiving. Japan needed 2.3 million barrels monthly to sustain offensive operations. It could deliver 1.4 million. That deficit of 900,000 barrels per month, compounded over 44 months of war, represents the fuel that might have trained the pilots lost at Philippine Sea, reinforced the positions bypassed in the island-hopping campaign, or enabled the fleet concentration that never materialized for the decisive battle Japanese doctrine demanded. Numbers don't lie, but people who calculate them do, sometimes from desperation, sometimes from pressure, sometimes from simple human error working under impossible conditions. Captain Ohnishi's mistake in 1941 didn't just doom ships or battles. It doomed an empire that went to war believing mathematics were on its side, only to discover, too late, that the numbers had been wrong from the very beginning. Japan fought World War II with courage, determination, and tactical brilliance. But it fought with fuel it didn't have, couldn't obtain, and couldn't sustain. In the end, arithmetic proved more decisive than any weapon, and the war Japan thought it could win was lost before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor, buried in the miscalculations of a logistics report on a cold November night in Tokyo.